Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of what is one of my favorite podcasts, and that is the Chris Endry podcast. If this is your first time listening, you may not be aware, but I routinely do topics that are suggested by my Patreon patrons. This week, I ran a poll with a lot of topics I'm interested in exploring. Those included things that I thought would be compelling and sexy, like why at some point a rehabilitation of Hitler will be inevitable. It's not something I'm endorsing, just something I think will happen. Why I think the EU might collapse. What are the ultimate likely end points of Israel's war on Gazans? And all these things I thought were quite sexy, but of course, shocking me was my Patreon audience. And I shouldn't be shocked because these are the creme de la creme of humanity, who have selected as today's topic, the routine traps of statistics. If that doesn't sound like it's your bag, don't worry too much. It's not going to be a mathematical journey because, well, one, because I'm not capable of it, but two, it's not what interests me about it. What we're going to be looking at is how common it is to see statistics invoked and completely misused, and how easy it is to fall for the trap of seeing data as a kind of truth, whether it's in marketing, politics, the news, or our own capacity to mount an argument for something that we think. It's incredibly easy and prevalent to fall into any number of traps. And so we're going to do a tour of those today, and I hope that it will be pretty fun because it'll be mostly example-based and a chance to explore some of the traps of thinking that are just out there generally. Before we get underway, though, I do have to thank all of my patrons, and a special extra thanks to my two new patrons, Rui Patrizio and Bambi Crude. Very excited to have you guys on board. If you want to be cool like them, go on to patreon.com/Endry and join up today. But in the meantime, let's all enjoy the sexiest topic on this planet, the routine traps of statistics. There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. That's a quote that is commonly misattributed to Mark Twain or Benjamin Disraeli. Not sure really who said it, but it doesn't matter. The point is it's a sentiment that has lasted across time because there's a tendency that we have to reduce information to its component parts and to present that as though it's an exhaustive truth. We use it as a proxy for truth, really. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of seeing a number as representing a reality, or seeing a trend as being indicative of something, or seeing a graph, or seeing complex mathematical models presented to us by people who know more than us and assuming that they're correct. And today, I want to unpack some of that. Firstly, to make us aware of the pitfalls that exist, or if you are already aware, just a nice little reminder tour. But also, secondly, to maybe point a little bit at one of the meta topics of this podcast generally that I like to flirt with, which is everywhere we're trying to capture with certainty our knowledge and understanding of the world and to map it. And almost everywhere we do that in a way that's flawed. I'm not suggesting that you go out and spit on the next graph that you see or never use numbers again in how you try to understand things. More to realize that the manipulation of data and the presentation of information through numbers is just one element of a toolkit of how you might want to seek to understand things, and it has its own limits, like any other. What makes it perhaps a more insidious tool than others is the temptation that we all have to give authority to it above other types of information. And when there are those who are adept at wielding the tool of statistics to present certain narratives, it can be easy for them to fool us into thinking that the world is different than it is. And there's endless number of incentives for people to do that, whether it's people seeking power, whether it's people hoping to retain power, whether it's people seeking money, whatever it is. And it's not always malicious wielding. They're also just critical thinking traps to fall into with the misuse of statistics. Anyway, enough on the abstract stuff. Let's get into some details. The first one I want to talk about is an obvious one that you will have come across a lot, which is correlation is not causation. So basically that means that information could be presented in tandem, and because we are pattern-seeking machines, our instinct is to assume that there's a connection between trends that are mapped, particularly if there is an argument that can be made to link them. But there's any number of reasons that something can be correlated to something else, and it's a mistake to assume that there's necessarily a relationship between whatever it is that's correlated, and even more of a mistake to assume that you know or can know why those things are correlated. I fell for this trap in high school. I went to my friend Saxby and I said to him confidently that I had read that 97% or something of people who use Head and Shoulders shampoo ended up with dandruff. He correctly thought I was being ridiculous by connecting those things because I was saying it as though there was a conspiracy where this shampoo was designed to give you dandruff. But of course, I mean, whilst that conspiracy may exist, I'm not debunking it here, it's not surprising at all that the people who would be using a dandruff shampoo would have dandruff. You could just as easily make such a link between any two things and assert that there's a relationship, particularly if it's something that's surprising or counterintuitive or something that people want to believe anyway. Say, for example, if you say, it turns out that statistically, people who go to visit the doctor for checkups and scans and everything actually have more illnesses and diseases than the people who never go to the doctor. And I'm sure that that one is true because obviously the population of people who are not seeking out going to the doctor are much more likely to not be sick. But beyond these sort of facetious examples, there are thornier ones that we use all the time, particularly in instances where we sense that it might be right, where it's our instinct that there is a connection. One example that comes to mind is there are studies that link Facebook use with reduced well-being. It's very easy to conclude, well, of course, Facebook reduces your well-being because it's a proxy for social connection and it's not as satisfying as doing other activities in your life. But of course, the causation flow could just as easily be in the opposite direction, which is people who have lower well-being are more likely to spend time on Facebook because they're not doing all those other activities that are perhaps linked to reporting higher well-being. But in reality, it's likely that there's a dynamic flow between the two of them, which is maybe you're not feeling good, so you start using Facebook a bit more. That's not so satisfying, so you feel worse, so you use it more, whatever. In this, I'm just speculating, but the point stands that it's very easy to take two things that seem like they're correlated and to connect them and then present it as a truth when there are other factors that you really need to examine to be able to make claims in these realms. Another one that came up for me recently in a conversation with friends is private school performance. I went to a very low performing state school and the cohort across 2 decades would have as much success as one single year would at one of the elite private schools, perhaps even less, to be honest. That it's easy to make the conclusion that if you want to do well in Victoria, you need to pay for education, and paying for education means you get a superior product, which means you do better at school. I think that that's a common assumption, and there will inevitably be elements of truth to it. To attribute success in academia and career stuff only to education is misleading because what you're getting in these cohorts is a kind of self-selection where families that value educating their kids are self-selecting out of the cohort who would send their kids to the school that I went to. It's obviously not that simple because there are financial constraints and things like that. But people who are willing to prioritize finding an extra $20,000 to send their kids to a school, they're probably more likely to have other factors in the children's home environment that will lead to them doing well. I mean, even the fact that they're able to expend those extra resources suggests that they would be people who are better positioned to spend more on education anyway, but also to stereotype from my own school is basically broken home high. Like I think almost all of my peers had divorced parents. And in that situation, you're potentially getting half the resources, at least in terms of time attention from parents. They're likely to be occupied with other things as they struggle to stay afloat and manage a household financially on their own. And there's just general less attention on, have you done your homework, what's coming up, et cetera, et cetera. And, those factors on their own, perhaps if you controlled for households, divorced households, economic status, and employment success of the parents, maybe then you're already rapidly. I assume by just doing that, you're rapidly reducing the difference between the performance of state school kids and private school kids. But you have to drill in to get to this point. But at the meta level, if it's presented to you that you've got a choice, you send your kids to a private school, here's the results, they're significantly better, or you send your kids to a state school, it's particularly worse, you may think that those are then your paths, but there's any number of factors that lead to success or less success. And another one that we use a lot, which is a statistic that sort of sits in our unconscious, is the divorce rates generally. I'm not sure if you've heard or said this, but 50% of marriages end in divorce. That taken on its own can easily mislead you to think that a marriage that you pursue would have a 50% chance of ending in divorce. Firstly, there are people that get married multiple times, and those people are obviously more likely to get divorced multiple times. Second marriages and third marriages have something like 70% chance of falling over because you've already demonstrated the capacity and willingness to get to end a marriage. You're more likely to do it again, and that bumps up the average. But also that number includes people that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who got married in an era where it was normal to marry your first partner at age 20, which is something that's basically unheard of now. And so it would make sense that having entered a bit more of agency into your adulthood and found a bit of footing in the world before choosing your partner that you may wish to marry or not, that your divorce risk would be lower. Anyway, I'm just pointing this out, not because I'm so interested in marriage, but what is presented at what can on the surface appear as if you get married, it's 50% chance you'll get divorced. For you, may actually be 10 or 15% once you control for the outliers and control for the specifics of your circumstance. And this goes to the next. This goes to the next point I want to make about statistics, is that so many statistics are presented as though they're universal truths, but once you control for even just a couple more variables, they don't individuate to the circumstances of the person looking at them at all. It's very easy to think that the averages of how things present or the odds of something occurring are uniform and smooth, as in the US, say, for example, a particular city has a rate of 30 gun homicides out of 100,000. And so you might look at that number and think, well, I don't like those odds, so I'm not going to live in that city. But unfortunately, the reality of it is, if you're a young black man and live in a certain part of a city, those odds may be 20, 30, 50 times that. Whereas if you are not, your odds may be a tenth of that. And this is because the outlier examples are blended in with the rest of the data when creating averages. So we need to be really wary when we look at statistics as though they represent all individuals. And it's a smug thing for Australians or Europeans to look at US life expectancy or minimum wage or even average wage or all of these things and to think that automatically our lives are superior and our way of doing things are better. But what can be missing in calculating that is the US, very sadly, contains a significant underclass who significantly change what those averages are. And so if you're a German middle-class car salesman, it can be easy to assume that your conditions would be superior in Germany, but they might not be. You might be making a lot more money in America and you might actually be healthier because of how their health system is skewed. I mean, I don't know. Probably not on the healthy thing because of the dietary stuff. But my point is more, there are so many things that are presented as claims to know with certainty and to explain reality, and we just always need to be wary of them. I have one tragic example of this from my own friendship group. I have a friend who was pregnant, and I honestly could do a whole episode just on the disastrous misuse of statistics and bad maths in the maternity wards across the world, because it is rife and jaw-dropping. But I'll just give this one example. My friend had a scan that indicated that her baby was at the 70th percentile. Her baby was going to be bigger than 70% of other babies, and they pushed her to have an induction so she would have her baby early, so it wouldn't be distressingly large for her to give birth to. And that sounds pretty reasonable on the surface. But what's missing from that is that my friend is also in the 70th percentile for size, and that the statistics of what they even classify as that percentile would include, people that include the women that are 4'7", as well as the women that are 6'10". But there's no consideration given to her specific circumstances in this. And so then she had this induction, and induction sounds like it's just the beginning of labor a bit earlier. And in a mechanical sense, it is, but there are a whole bunch of complex processes in a woman's body to prepare for giving birth. And skipping those steps early kind of, for her, meant a really painful birth. And her conclusion from this horrible experience was that she was never going to have any more children. And her baby was born, and guess what? There's a plus 20 or minus margin of error in the measuring. Her baby was born at the 50th percentile. So it was completely needless. It was an extremely painful thing for her. And it resulted in her choosing something pretty significant, which is to never have any more children. This is just one example of one person in the misuse of statistics. But you can imagine what the consequences are when statistics are used to inform things like policies for entire areas of health, the economy of entire nations, or how to conduct a war, or, whatever it is. It's not a joke to want to pursue better literacy in this stuff and to be skeptical of claims of certainty in domains in which we don't deserve them. So that specific example I just gave is a very common one of the use of average without regards to distribution, because there are some realms in which the averages are pretty closely clustered. Like if you were to look at the number of meals that average person has a day and say it's 3.5, you could pretty reasonably assume that if you pick a random person, they're having somewhere around that number of meals a day. But if you look at something else like incomes in a company, maybe you've got a printing company, there's 200 people, the average income is $30,000. That figure could basically be achieved if everybody made $28,000 and there was one CEO that made $500,000. Don't check the exact maths, but you can understand how just measuring the average doesn't give you an indication of what you can expect from the cohort. So in that example of the people working at the company, if you're looking to set up a market where you're trying to sell luxury goods and 1 in 200 people make $500,000, but you just look at the average and you see, everyone who lives in this area makes $28,000. It's not worth trying to sell our Cartier watches there or whatever, then you've missed an opportunity and totally misread the situation. I mean, maybe if you share my values as a listener, you don't give a shit about maximizing the world so people could sell Cartier watches. To pick another example, I was very poor in the society that I lived in, Canberra, and it was a place with a very high average of wealth. Consequently, there were no great systems designed for the problems of poorer people there, because everyone just assumes that everyone's well off or they're connected to someone that's well off. Because if on a given street, you've got 100 people that all make $100,000 a year and they're one who makes zero. If you take the average of the data, what do you got? You could say, oh, look, the average income is almost $100,000. This is a well-off street. And if you take that data, you can then mount a case saying that we don't need to provide support services because this is the average income or whatever it is. I'm not saying that there aren't methods to easily attain the truth of what that scenario is and to better represent it. I'm just saying that when you do hear certain things like averages used, you need to be careful because they could be hiding extreme spikes. Because in realms where there are extremes, they can be completely hidden and missed. Another trap with using statistics is to not compare like with like. And this is something you see all the time because it's tempting to do, and it's easier to use the reductive units of a particular time and equate them as though they're the same. But of course, $1 now is not the same as $1 even 1 year ago, but certainly not 50 years ago. And if you were to look at a graph and see how people's incomes have risen over time without indexing that to inflation, you're not really getting useful information at all. In fact, if you find out that this year you're getting a 3% pay rise and you're really chuffed, well, if you don't then find out also that inflation's gone up 5% and actually CPI has gone up 8%, what you've achieved is a real world cut in your income. And having that information would change how you react to the situation. Similarly, you could take something like cancer deaths and say this year, 20% of people that die will die of cancer. Whereas did you know 10,000 years ago, only 4% of people died of cancer? We have a cancer pandemic. And regardless of the specific details of whether that's true, the missing part of that data is the context. You're not comparing like with like, because if people are dying from violent deaths at 38, they don't have the chance to contract all the cancers that we have today. And so you're not really getting a good read on the situation because of incomplete information. You also see a lot of abstract stuff measured from society to society, or even within the same location and same population, but in different times. And it's really tempting to fall into this because things like satisfaction, happiness, well-being, health, things, if they're self-reported, they don't mean the same thing to any two people. In fact, if you were to ask me and a similarly demographic friend what we consider happiness to be, I'm sure we'd have totally different answers. And yet, if you produce a graph saying that people in the Bahamas report that they're 7 out of 10 happy, but people in Iceland report that they're 4 out of 10 happy, then that'll make a newspaper article. That'll do the rounds. That'll be on Instagram stories, et cetera, when there's any number of reasons why those things may be different. And none of those reasons necessarily point us to think that people in the Bahamas are definitely happier than people in Iceland. There just may be different cultural conceptions of how you see that word and the meaning of it. There may be different conceptions on how much you feel expected to say that you're happy or whatever it is. You can see how these things would be different. And yet you can also see how as that particular example is so catchy that it will definitely be a headline when somebody gets some PhD funding to do the studies and to report on it. Another one that you often see is the increasing mental health crisis stuff. It's really hard to know what's useful data to take because higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD. I mean, if you look at if you look at a graph and see that there's more PTSD today than there was just after World War I, I mean, it's hard to take that seriously. What instead we have is a higher conception of these things and a higher understanding, a higher likelihood to report them. There's all these factors that can't actually be controlled for when presenting that data or using those statistics. But it would be very normal if I was the CEO of Beyond Blue Australia, I would take that data and say, look, people are more depressed. We need more funding. People are more depressed. People need to spend more time thinking about the thing that is important to me. Now, I do actually happen to think that people are more depressed than in recent history, but I could be wrong, and all the data could bear that out, and I could still be completely wrong. There's a very funny comedian in Budapest that I saw, she's Finnish, and she had a joke saying that Finland had the highest happiness rates in the world, but they also have one of the highest suicide rates. And the implied gag is that the people who are the most unhappy are removing themselves from the reporting data. So you again have the situation of incomplete information. SSRI usage is something that I casually like to look at because it's an interesting new phenomenon. And it's higher, the SSRI usage is higher in college educated people than non-college educated people. And if you receive that fact in isolation, you might think, oh, well, it makes sense because college educated people are more likely to be intelligent and it's painful to be intelligent in the world, or they're more likely to do office work, which is isolating and painful. But in reality, it could easily just be completely explained by they're more likely to have higher incomes. So they're more likely to pursue healthcare and plans that give them those sorts of prescriptions. I don't know. Similarly, in exactly the same sphere, the rate of SSRI usage in the US is something like 13%. And you could track that on its own and see it goes slightly up, slightly down. But in just doing that, it's incomplete information and you miss what perhaps the bigger stories are, which is in women over 60, it's 25%. So it's basically double. And in white people, it's significantly higher than it is in Black or Hispanic people. And, what do you do with that data? You find different conclusions. It could be the case that each ream of the data you step into, you completely invert whatever your previous inferences were. Not unusual at all. If I'm a politician and for whatever reason I'm pushing a barrow to get people to reduce their SSRI usage and that figure goes down 1%, I could be trumping as a big win, whereas one cohort could have tripled their usage and it would be missing. And it would be up to somebody else to find it, to share that information. This is why it's actually so important to listen to competing voices on certain topics, or maybe just to do your own work and to not listen to certain people at all, because there are so many incentives to present bad information with statistics. Another common misrepresentation of treating like for like things that aren't is certain policies will be tried somewhere and they'll work, and then they'll be advocated in other environments where there's just no chance that they will work. And there are a few that come to mind, but one is the US's stated project of installing certain kinds of states in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, that collapsed horribly. It was unlikely ever to work because there's a certain cultural and historical context behind the establishment of Western liberal democracies. And if those conditions don't exist, you can't just transpose the ideas somewhere else without them appearing as other things. That's an easy one to scoff at because it looks ridiculous. But similarly, you see people all the time say, in Australia, we had a gun buyback under John Howard after the Port Arthur massacre, and we successfully radically reduced the amount of guns in the country. We don't have anywhere near the rate of gun crime as they do in the US. Well, advocate that solution all you want to the Americans. There's just no world in which that's a policy lever that they can even pull. There's something like 400 million guns there. They can't just simply buy them up. Plus, they have a constituency that has had centuries of cultural acclamation to the idea that they're entitled to that stuff. And so the nature of the resistance to such a policy would be far more extreme. It just doesn't realistically exist, and yet you see people advocate it. Similarly, you see people push for all sorts of Scandinavian welfare settings to exist in non-Scandinavian countries. And unfortunately, the proof is sort of in the pudding. Those policies seem to exist largely because of a tight ethnic homogeneity and shared sense of cultural history and whatever. People seem to be much happier to pay 70% tax or whatever it is to pay for their neighbors' school lunches or whatever if they feel like if they can see a lot of things in common between them and their neighbors than in societies that have high mix of cultures and a wider range of disparate cultural narratives on how to live and why to live. Those policies seem to be less popular. So it's not just an off-the-shelf option. It would be really like, I personally might love a lot of those policies if they were to come in Australia, but they're not just things that you could just pick up off the shelf and transpose as though they're going to be like for like. So it's all well and good to say, to pick up a study and say 80% of Norwegian people are really happy to pay for everybody's university education and to give everyone a good meal and to give them accommodation while they do it because they know people will get back to society. You can't transpose that to other societies and assume that people will feel the same. But it's a type of statistical manipulation that you see all the time. Another statistical trap that you see a lot is in the problem of silent evidence. A classic example of this is Greek sophist Diagoras, who was shown painted portraits of worshippers who prayed and then survived a shipwreck. And he replied, "Where are the pictures of those who prayed, then drowned?" So in narratives where we're looking at, say, for example, what's successful or unsuccessful, it's very easy to miss the context of all the instances that don't register a blip on whatever it is that we're looking at. For example, in wanting to become a successful footballer, you naturally would look at the people who are great footballers and look at what their training is, look where they went to learn, look what they eat, look how they spend their days or whatever. But what you're missing from that is for every successful athlete that you look at who does all those things, there could be and probably are 10,000 who did exactly the same thing, but for various other factors were not able to become professional athletes. The same is true in looking at successful examples of business or successful examples of policies or failures as well. It's just another example of how having incomplete information in trying to navigate the world can lead us to use numbers, data points, whatever it is, to incorrectly assess what is happening or has happened. Maybe another classic one is the survivorship bias image that you see of, I'll put it on my Instagram. There's a plane. So in evaluating the returned bombers during World War II, they saw where there was damage to the plane, and the planes returning tended to be shot in the same places. And so it would be natural to conclude, oh, we need to reinforce those places. But what's missing is the silent evidence that we're only getting the data from the planes that return. The ones that weren't shot in those places didn't return. So in fact, you're getting the inverse conclusion, which is it's actually the places where there are no bullet marks on your returning planes that you want to be reinforcing. As I keep stating, the problem with relying on statistics without interrogating them, particularly ones that you get from others, is that there are so many incentives for people to misuse them to prosecute a case. Business people want to look more successful. Marketers want to sell you things. Politicians want you to go along with whatever narrative it is that they're pushing. And not just that, all of us want our worldviews to be validated. And as part of that, we want the worldviews that are counter to ours to be invalidated. And so it's very easy, even unconsciously, to cherry pick data to forward a case incorrectly. It's something I've done. It's something I'm sure we've all done at different points because it's so easy to do. And it doesn't even need to be malicious, and it's not a sign of stupidity or anything like that. Extraordinarily intelligent man, Robert McNamara was, amongst other things, Secretary of Defense under LBJ during the Vietnam War. And it was his job to prosecute that war favorably for the Americans. And the way in which he did that has, sadly for him, given name to the McNamara fallacy, because what he did was he fixated upon a few data points as metrics of success, looking at quantitative stuff without examining the qualitative context. So in this instance, what he was doing was looking at the body count between American soldiers and Vietnamese soldiers as metrics for how the war was going. But of course, you don't need to be the US Secretary of Defense to understand that there are other factors at play in determining whether or not that war is going to be going well for you. And of course, that war ended in total disaster and US withdrawal, because it wasn't the case that the ratio of American troops dying to Vietnamese troops dying was the determining factor in how that was going to play out. And given the catastrophe of that, you would think that there would be a pretty stark lesson and we wouldn't be making those mistakes these days. But I contend that it's exactly what's happening in the Russian-Ukraine war now, where Western leaders smugly talk about the slow rate at which Russia is taking territory and points to the losses that they're taking to do it. But that presupposes that these are their main values and their main strategies. Even if it's wrong, you could take them at their own stated value. Their goal in that war is neither to conquer Ukraine nor to do it quickly. So then, being concerned about territory and time suddenly seems pretty arbitrary. And in fixating on that data, if you lose sight of the other data, such as the total attrition of Ukrainian troops and the decay of that society, suddenly you would change your assessment and, I hope, subsequently change your policies in that realm. So in that instance with the McNamara fallacy, it's not so much that we're unable to know things. It's more the issue of pretending to know things in domains in which we don't. And so it's more the social response to the statistics themselves that becomes the trap rather than the extraction of them or the discourse using them. It's this tendency that we have to give total authority to information when it's presented in certain ways. And we put it in a hierarchy above other information, such as you may call good old-fashioned common sense or individual experiences or whatever it might be. All those things are pretty happily sidelined again and again in the face of authoritative figures bearing data. And there are various tools that we use to improve the statistics that we get, but the average citizen doesn't equip themselves with the tools needed to usefully interrogate what is good data and what is junk. And even the accepted tools that we have are not necessarily great in all instances. To overcome the problem of sample bias, there are sort of accepted standards of how many people you should ask to get an indicative sample of something. But if I ask 1,000 students of Sydney University whether they think tuition should be free, I shouldn't pick Sydney. If I ask 1,000 students of the University of Melbourne whether they think that university should be free, I'm going to get a significantly different response to if I ask 1,000 people working at the Loy Yang coal plant in Latrobe. And similarly, if I ask 1 billion people whether or not they're lactose intolerant, and I get the response of 92%, maybe we can conclude that it's dangerous for humans to drink milk. But it could just be the case that I just did my sampling in China, where 92% of people are lactose intolerant. It sounds like the kind of thing that is so obvious and stupid that it would never fly. But that's basically what we've done in our construction of whole disciplines in psychology and behavioral science, where many of the founding principles are not even from 1,000 people, but will be from a study of 30 people, and they'll all be men of a tiny slice of that demographic in that they're all Harvard students between the age of 19 and 30. And of course, that's not an indicative representation of that campus, let alone of humanity. And yet many of the social sciences have taken decades of authority of telling people how life is and how people are without looking at basically everybody on the planet. If you're a woman and you've ever been to a doctor, I'm sure you know exactly how far-reaching the consequences of this type of blind spot are and can be. So you've got to be especially wary of advice that you get that's data-based in realms that are chaotic, because the more chaotic a system is, the more dynamic a system is in that one thing influences another, and you push the balloon on this side, it blows out on the other, et cetera, et cetera. The more chaotic it is, the less likely we are to understand it, and therefore the less likely that specific claims of certainty are to be true. Unfortunately, these claims abound most in chaotic realms that are ones that are sources, understandably, of great importance to us, like health, diet, relationships, parenting, babies, well-being, economic distribution, the environment. These are all realms where it's very, very hard to know certain things because there are so many interrelating factors at play. And yet, I guess, exactly for that reason, they're the domains in which people are seeking solace and seeking certainty. I think rather than taking that solace in shorthand claims of people who think that they know everything, such as, for example, you need to cut out gluten to live forever, or having a cesarean means that your child will grow up with a low IQ, or wherever the specific claims may land. Instead, I think the onus is on us to embrace a little bit of that uncertainty and to realize that there are things that we can't know, or at least to be aware of these statistical traps when listening to the gurus of those realms profess their expertise wielding statistical data. So hopefully that's a useful introduction to the topic. I'm happy to dive right more into it and do a second part because there's just so much stuff to talk about on even just any one of these points. I hope it didn't feel too rushed. But also, I ironically realized that I may have fallen victim to you not being interested in this at all, because whilst it was the leading vote receiver of my topics, it received only 15%. So it could well be the case that 85% of my listeners hate this topic and they don't want anything to do with it. And they would literally pick everyone but this, but they didn't cluster around anything strongly enough. So which one is it? Get in touch. If this was interesting to you or useful in any way, please do let me know, because your feedback helps me a lot in shaping what we get to explore here. And if you want to be a part of the subsequent episodes and what we choose to explore, head on over to patreon.com/Andrew and join. Thanks so much to my existing patrons, and thank you to you all for listening. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to give 5 stars, thumbs up, share the episode, whatever it is, I can't tell you how much that stuff helps me to do more of this, which is what I love. All right, we'll be back with doubtless something completely different next week, and I'm already looking forward to it. Take care wherever you are. Bye.